The rhythmic, warm melody of an old stringed instrument seemed to echo through the rolling green expanse of the hills, telling a story that many had come to love, a story about a man named Jed. He was a good, honest, but very poor mountaineer who spent his days wandering the rugged terrain, doing his absolute best just to keep his family fed. Life was a daily struggle of humble means until one fateful day when everything changed in the blink of an eye. Jed was out in the woods, aiming his rifle at some wild game to bring home for dinner, when he pulled the trigger and missed the food entirely. However, the stray bullet struck the earth, and up to the ground come a bubbling crude oil, that is, black gold, or as the locals love to call it, Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed is a sudden millionaire, his life transformed by the wealth hidden beneath the soil. The well-meaning kinfolk gathered around in sheer amazement and said, "Jed, move away from there." They all insisted that California was the absolute place he ought to be to start a brand new life. So, with hearts full of hope and excitement, they loaded up their trusty old truck with every single possession they owned, and they moved straight to Beverly Hills, that is, a land of shimmering swimming pools, dazzling movie stars, and grand estates, welcoming the family that the world would soon know as the Beverly Hillbillies. On a bright and sunny morning in the heart of Beverly Hills, the grand mansion of the Clabberts family was filled with the usual cheerful chaos. Inside the elegant corridors, Miss Jane, a dedicated and perpetually organized secretary, was adjusting her papers when she saw the head of the household. "Good morning, Mr. Clabberts," she said with a warm, professional smile, greeting Jed Clabberts as he stepped into the room with his signature calm demeanor. Jed nodded politely, his mind clearly occupied with the whereabouts of his beloved family members, and asked if Granny and Ellie Mae were back from their trip to the hills yet. Jane shook her head gently, replying that they were not back just yet, but they were expected to arrive any minute, adding that she sure would be glad to see them because keeping a wild animal fed in the meantime was proving to be quite a heavy chore. Jed chuckled softly, realizing there might be a slight misunderstanding, and quickly clarified that he did not mean Jethro when talking about chores. He explained that Ellie Mae had left him in charge of her precious grizzly cub before she departed, and the little bear went after its vegetables a whole heap like Jethro did when he was hungry. With complete innocence and genuine curiosity, Jed looked at the refined secretary and asked if she had ever burped a bear in her life. Miss Jane blinked in absolute astonishment, repeating the words in a daze, wondering how one would even begin to burp a bear, but before she could formulate a proper response, the booming voice of her employer cut through the air. "Oh, good morning, Chief," Jane said, turning quickly as Mr. Drysdale, the anxious and high-strung bank president, marched into the space looking completely overwhelmed. Jed, ever the hospitable host, noticed the tension and offered that if that was a personal or important call, he would gladly leave 15 cents for the trouble. Jane, always eager to be helpful, chimed in to say that if anyone needed her to come over and help with the situation, she actually possessed some genuine experience handling difficult beasts. Jed smiled warmly at her generosity, stating that it was real nice of her, but Cousin Bessie was already doing a fine job helping with the other little critters around the house, and besides, Jethro would be back from the airport with the womenfolk any time now. "Well," Jane began to say, offering further assistance, but her voice was drowned out by a sudden commotion down the hall, causing her to cry out for everyone to get back away and come here, realizing she had to hang up the line immediately because Captain Bligh wanted her. Mr. Drysdale, looking like a man who had survived a minor storm, glared around the room and demanded to know where his morning newspaper was. Jane looked at him with an expression of deep concern, gently advising that she really did not think the chief should see the paper today because it would only upset his already fragile nerves. Drysdale threw his hands up in utter disbelief, asking how a simple newspaper could possibly upset him any more after everything he had already been through with those lovable but unpredictable hillbillies. He began to list his recent grievances at the top of his lungs, reminding her that Jethro had received his official military induction notice, and instead of preparing normally, Jed had gone out and bought the boy an actual military tank. Drysdale groaned, recalling how he had been forced to be the tank crew, dressed up like Don Hindenburg, which ultimately led to his embarrassing arrest, so the idea of being upset by a mere morning paper seemed completely ridiculous. Jane tried to calm him down, whispering that nobody in the entire bank would hear his shouting, but Drysdale was too far gone in his misery. He buried his face in his hands, crying out that if this news got out to the public, he would be completely ruined. He began to sob dramatically, prompting Jane to pat his shoulder comfortingly, telling him to stop crying because old soldiers never truly cry. Drysdale whimpered that the entire situation was profoundly unfair, especially since Jethro had dressed up completely like General Patton and absolutely nobody had even noticed or arrested him. Jane assured the banker that the ordeal was finally over, as Jethro had promised to return the tank, and right at this very moment, the young man was bringing Granny and Ellie Mae safely home from the airport. Meanwhile, out on the streets of Beverly Hills, the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery shattered the neighborhood quiet as the military tank rolled down the pavement. Inside the cramped metal vehicle, Granny was shouting at the top of her lungs, causing Jethro to complain bitterly that she was absolutely busting his eardrums with all the noise. Granny told them both to hush up right that instant, while Jethro muttered to himself that this was definitively the last time he was ever going to hold females inside his beautiful tank. Back at the mansion, the tank finally ground to a halt, and Jed walked out to greet them, looking at his nephew with a mixture of confusion and mild amusement. Jed stated that he thought Jethro had taken that tank straight back to the place where he had originally obtained it. Jethro grinned proudly from the hatch, explaining that he did intend to do just that, but when he saw the immense kind of respect a true tank general gets from the public, he simply had to buy it back immediately. He excitedly told his uncle that Jed should have seen the crowd saluting him at the airport, including soldiers, sailors, Marines, and the Air Force, all showing immense respect to him, Granny, and Ellie Mae as they sat proudly in the tank. Granny, looking thoroughly exhausted and slightly disheveled, climbed out of the vehicle and immediately called for Jed to fetch her special medical bag. Jed gasped, asking if she was hurt anywhere, but Granny quickly clarified that the medicine was not for her, but rather for the general, meaning Jethro, adding that she herself was not hurt because she had not even gone down into the deep part of the tank yet. Jed placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, reminding her that Jethro was officially going into the army soon, so they all ought to be easy on the boy during his final days at home. Granny scoffed loudly, asking Jed if he had any remote idea what that boy had put Ellie Mae and her through during that wild ride, complaining that there was absolutely no room in that metal contraption for 4 individuals. Jed paused, his eyes widening slightly as he processed her words, and asked with surprise if she had just said the number 4. Jethro beamed, nodding happily, and announced that they had brought back a wonderful surprise from their trip, calling out for Pearl to come along with them. Ellie Mae stepped forward, holding a very large, incredibly calm pig in her arms, coaxing the animal gently by telling Pearl to come with her. Jed stared at the animal, and Ellie Mae explained that they had named the pig after Jethro's mother because it was the human Pearl who had originally given the creature to them. Jethro, trying to defend his military vehicle, told the group that they were entirely deluded about the animal, claiming that the pig was actually the quietest and most well-behaved female in the entire tank. Granny snapped at him, telling him he was actively asking for trouble, but Jethro stood tall in his uniform, warning the civilian to watch out because they were currently speaking to a genuine 4-star, 2-gun general. He then ordered his family members to go and take the heavy suitcases upstairs, declaring aloud that he was in desperate need of a personal military aid. Jed, watching his nephew with a shake of his head, remarked dryly that first aid was usually a matter of medicine rather than military ranking. Mr. Drysdale, who had just walked outside to witness the spectacle, stared at the massive tank in absolute horror, stating that it was his clear understanding Jethro had gotten rid of the machine. Jed admitted that it was his understanding as well, but plans had clearly changed. Drysdale took a deep breath, turning to Jane and whispering that there was only one logical way to stop this absolute foolishness once and for all, asserting that Jethro must be officially inducted into the United States Army right now, this very day. Jane reminded him that the boy could not possibly be inducted yet because he had not even had his official physical examination. Drysdale pleaded with her to think about the consequences, arguing that if they delayed, that eccentric young man might decide to join the Navy next, which would undoubtedly lead to Jed buying him an actual destroyer ship, or if he chose the Air Force, Jed might end up buying him a massive B-52 bomber. Just at that moment, Jed walked up behind them, having caught the last part of the conversation, and asked with great interest what they were saying about him buying a B-52. Drysdale, quickly trying to cover his tracks, forced a smile and said he was just wondering what Jed might like to buy for an upcoming 52nd birthday. Jed smiled warmly, thinking it was a lovely thought, while Miss Jane asked Granny what she reckoned the boy would truly like for his birthday, to which Granny replied humorously that the boy would simply like to be 52 years old again. Jed looked around the yard and asked where Ellie Mae had disappeared to, and Jane replied that she was currently out back spending time with the pig. Drysdale peered toward the house, asking if Jethro was still wearing that ridiculous general uniform, noting that speaking of Jethro, the boy absolutely could not enter the army until he passed a strict physical examination. Hearing this, Granny stood up straight, her eyes flashing with determination, and announced that she would go get her medical bag right this second and take care of the entire examination herself. A short while later, inside the mansion's improvised medical room, Jethro was lounging in his full military gear when Mr. Bradfield, an associate, walked in. Granny entered the room with her supplies and immediately ordered Jethro to go in yonder and take his clothes off right away. Jethro looked confused, asking what for, since he was supposed to be preparing to go on strategic military maneuvers. Granny explained that she was going to give him a thorough physical examination, but Mr. Bradfield quickly intervened, explaining to Granny that the boy would eventually be examined by a certified, official Army doctor. Granny waved her hand dismissively, stating that it was one of those terrible medical individuals that had unfortunately caused the demise of Jed's distant cousin. Bradfield asked in confusion if an army doctor had really done that, and Jed, who had just entered, nodded solemnly, stating that he reckoned it was true, identifying the culprit as general peritonitis. Bradfield sighed heavily, explaining with extreme patience that general peritonitis was absolutely not a medical doctor but rather a serious medical condition, but Jed just shrugged, saying they had eventually found that out the hard way. Granny turned back to Jethro, ordering the boy again to take his clothes off, declaring fiercely that she was absolutely not going to let those rough army doctors get their hands on that innocent child. She argued that to the military, Jethro was just a meaningless number, but to her, he was Pearl's precious baby boy, and she had made a solemn promise to take care of him forever. Jethro, looking slightly embarrassed, asked if Granny could please just let the official army doctors examine him instead. Granny softened her voice, telling her sweetheart that those military doctors were simply too rough, whereas she possessed the soft, gentle hands of a true healer. Jethro mumbled under his breath that her hands were about as soft as a wild alligator's hide, but he obeyed the command to take his clothes off anyway. Out in the front yard, Jane was watching Jed carefully polish the exterior of the massive military vehicle. She smiled gently and suggested that Mr. Claberts should not waste his precious time polishing that silly little old tank. Jed paused, looking at the metal surface, and admitted that maybe she was right, especially since Jethro was already asking him to buy a great big, brand new model anyway. Jane gasped softly, describing the current one as a beautiful tank, and begged Mr. Claberts please not to buy Jethro any more military equipment under any circumstances. She assured him that the United States Army would take complete care of all those details, as they would train him properly, outfit him in the correct gear, and give him 3 square meals a day, ultimately turning him into a real, honorable fighting man. Jed nodded, smiling at the thought, and remarked that the Army sure would turn him into a fighting man, especially if they managed to cut his massive appetite down to just 3 meals a day. He then looked around and asked where the boy was currently located, and Jane reminded him that Granny was inside giving him his private physical examination. Jane emphasized that the physical was another perfect example of something the official army would take care of, completely unlike the unusual methods Granny used. Back inside, Granny was holding a thermometer and peering closely at the readings, announcing that the boy's temperature was perfectly normal at 142 degrees. Jethro looked alarmed, stating that 142 degrees definitely did not sound normal for a human being. Granny explained calmly that it was a perfectly normal reading if the thermometer had just been thoroughly sterilized in boiling water right before use. She then commanded him to cross his legs because she wanted to check his physical reflexes. Jethro winced